The train slowed as it approached the camp outside Hearne, Texas, in late summer 1943, and Oberleutnant Klaus Weber pressed his face against the window watching scrubland and cotton fields pass until the vehicle jerked to a stop and American guards began shouting orders in English that most of the German prisoners didn't understand but whose meaning was clear from gestures and rifle positions, and Weber descended from the railcar with the other captured Afrika Korps soldiers, expecting the treatment that propaganda had prepared them for, expecting brutality from Americans who Nazi training had described as racially mongrelized barbarians, expecting starvation because Germany was supposedly the only nation that understood discipline and organization, expecting humiliation because Americans were portrayed as vengeful and crude, expecting conditions that would make dying in combat seem preferable to surviving as prisoner. But what he saw as guards herded them through gates topped with barbed wire into a compound of wooden barracks arranged in neat rows was not what he'd been taught to expect. The barracks were clean, recently constructed, painted white, each with windows that weren't barred, with doors that opened inward, with spaces that looked more like military housing than prison cells, and the guards who processed them were professional rather than brutal, were following procedures rather than indulging cruelty, were treating prisoners like enemy soldiers rather than like subhumans, and this discrepancy between expectation and reality created confusion that would persist through Weber's years of American captivity. Confusion born from recognizing that everything he'd been taught about America might be lies but not yet understanding what truth would replace those lies. The processing involved medical examination by American doctors who were thorough and clinical, involved delousing procedures that were humiliating but functional, involved assignment to barracks and work details and explanation through interpreters of camp rules and Geneva Convention protections, and throughout this processing Weber and his fellow prisoners waited for the brutality to begin, waited for guards to demonstrate the sadism that propaganda had promised, waited for the facade of professionalism to drop and reveal the barbarity beneath, but the facade never dropped because it wasn't facade. This was simply how Americans operated their POW camps, with bureaucratic efficiency and legal compliance and the kind of casual professionalism that totalitarian mindsets struggled to process because it suggested that rules mattered more than ideology, that procedures existed independent of political passion, that Americans could imprison enemies without hating them personally. And this separation of duty from emotion was alien to soldiers raised in a system where ideology infected everything, where personal relationships were subordinate to political loyalty, where hatred was cultivated as virtue rather than being treated as destructive passion that undermined discipline. German soldiers arriving at American POW camps between 1943 and 1945, eventually totaling 425,000 prisoners held in over 500 camps scattered across the United States from Texas to Wisconsin to California, carried ideological frameworks built from years of Nazi propaganda that had described America in terms designed to make German soldiers prefer death to capture. America was portrayed as racially chaotic civilization in decline, as nation of mongrels without culture, as place where Jewish influence had corrupted government and where black populations threatened white civilization and where immigration had destroyed whatever Germanic virtues early settlers might have possessed. And this propaganda wasn't just abstract ideology but was operationally relevant because soldiers who believed capture meant torture and death fought harder, held positions longer, accepted casualties more readily than soldiers who believed surrender might be a survivable option, and so Nazi training emphasized that Americans would abuse prisoners, would violate whatever international laws existed, would allow their inferior racial character to express itself through cruelty, and German soldiers internalized these beliefs not because they were stupid or uniquely susceptible to propaganda but because propaganda reinforced cultural assumptions, because totalitarian systems control information effectively, because soldiers trust their governments and their officers especially when fighting, makes independent verification impossible, and because nothing in their experience had contradicted what they'd been taught until they arrived in America and discovered that propaganda's predictions didn't match observed reality, and had to decide whether their observations or their ideology was more reliable guide to truth. The POW camps operated under Geneva Convention regulations that America followed not from altruism but from legal obligation and from recognition that treating enemy prisoners according to international law protected American prisoners held by enemies, from understanding that violations would be reciprocated and that compliance created incentive for reciprocal compliance. And so the camps were inspected regularly by Red Cross representatives who verified conditions and reported violations, were operated according to detailed regulations about housing and food and medical care and work requirements, were documented through paperwork that tracked every prisoner and every complaint and every aspect of operations because American bureaucracy approached imprisonment the same way it approached everything, through systematic documentation and procedural compliance and the assumption that following established rules produced acceptable outcomes. The barracks housing German prisoners were wooden structures similar to those housing American troops at domestic bases, contained bunks and stoves and windows and communal spaces, were neither luxurious nor deliberately uncomfortable, were simply functional military housing that met minimum standards, and prisoners received food rations that were officially equivalent to what American troops received, roughly 4,000 calories daily, which was more than German soldiers had received even before the war and vastly more than German civilians were receiving by 1943, and received medical care that was competent and professional and available without restriction because Geneva Conventions required treating wounded prisoners, and because American medical capacity was sufficient that treating prisoners didn't significantly impact treating American casualties. Educational programs were established that allowed prisoners to take correspondence courses, to access libraries that contained books in German, to attend lectures and classes, to pursue education that would be useful after repatriation. And these programs weren't motivated by desire to be kind but by recognition that keeping prisoners occupied and mentally engaged reduced discipline problems and made camp management easier, and the effect was that German prisoners could continue education that war had interrupted, could develop skills that would be valuable in reconstruction, could use captivity productively rather than merely enduring it, and this educational access was remarkable not because America was uniquely generous but because totalitarian systems don't trust prisoners with unsupervised education while democracies default to assuming that education is beneficial rather than threatening. The first shocks of American life came not from dramatic events but from observing normalcy that totalitarian indoctrination had taught them shouldn't exist. Prisoners assigned to work details in towns near camps saw teenagers at soda fountains laughing and flirting without adult supervision, saw casual social mixing that German youth organizations had prohibited, saw young people who seemed unaware that their country was at war or who were aware but whose lives continued in patterns that looked like peacetime, and this casual continuation of normal life while war was being fought suggested either that Americans were frivolous and undisciplined or that American society was so robust that war didn't disrupt civilian existence. And German prisoners struggled to reconcile these observations with propaganda that had described America as weak and decadent because the observed decadence. Teenagers wasting time on trivial pleasures coexisted with industrial production that was supplying both American and Allied forces with equipment that German industry couldn't match. They heard music on radios that was playing constantly in homes and businesses, heard jazz and popular music that Nazi ideology had condemned as racially degenerate, heard musical styles that were energetic and creative and popular, and the fact that this condemned music was ubiquitous suggested either that Americans were too undisciplined to maintain racial purity or that Nazi characterizations of racial degeneracy were wrong and that music was just music without the ideological weight that totalitarian thinking attached to it. They saw women driving trucks and operating machinery and managing farms while their husbands were overseas. Saw women functioning independently in roles that German ideology said women couldn't or shouldn't perform, saw that American industrial mobilization was partly enabled by using half the population that German mobilization had left underutilized because ideology said women belonged in domestic roles, and the effectiveness of American women in industrial and agricultural roles challenged assumptions about what women could accomplish and suggested that ideology had been limiting German efficiency by excluding capable workers based on gender. They heard farmers and workers and ordinary Americans openly criticizing President Roosevelt, heard political dissent expressed casually in public without fear of arrest or retaliation, heard people complaining about rationing or government policies or war management in tones that suggested disagreement with government was normal and acceptable, and this casual dissent was perhaps most destabilizing observation because totalitarian systems equate dissent with treason while democratic systems treat dissent as normal part of political discourse, and witnessing Americans criticize their government freely without facing consequences suggested that maybe political loyalty didn't require ideological uniformity, suggested that maybe societies could function without enforcing thought conformity, suggested that freedom didn't necessarily produce chaos but could coexist with functional governance. The racial dynamics that German prisoners encountered in America were complex and contradictory in ways that both challenged and sometimes reinforced Nazi racial ideology. In some camps, particularly in the South, black guards and medical personnel worked with German prisoners, and some prisoners found themselves being treated by black doctors or receiving orders from black sergeants, And this interaction with Black Americans in positions of authority challenged Nazi teaching that portrayed Black people as inherently inferior, challenged the assumption that racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable, challenged prisoners to recognize that capability wasn't determined by race. But simultaneously prisoners observed American racial segregation, observed that Black and white Americans often worked in separate facilities and lived in separate neighborhoods and used separate public accommodations, observed that America's own behavior suggested racial distinctions mattered even if American ideology officially denied racial hierarchy. And this contradiction between American democratic principles and American racial practices was obvious to German prisoners who'd been trained to notice such inconsistencies, though the contradiction worked differently than Nazi propaganda predicted because what prisoners observed wasn't racial chaos leading to civilizational collapse, but rather was complex society managing internal tensions while simultaneously defeating Germany militarily and outproducing Germany industrially, suggesting that maybe social perfection wasn't prerequisite for national effectiveness, suggesting that maybe societies could be imperfect and still functional, suggesting that maybe Nazi claims about racial purity being essential for national strength were wrong because America's racial complexity coexisted with capabilities that exceeded Germany's despite lacking the racial homogeneity that Nazi ideology claimed was necessary for greatness. The wartime labor integration that prisoners observed, Black and white Americans working together in factories and fields to support war production, demonstrated that pragmatic necessity could override racial customs, demonstrated that American racial practices were flexible rather than absolute, demonstrated that America's approach to race was evolving rather than fixed, and while this didn't excuse American racism or suggest American racial relations were healthy, it did show German prisoners that racial ideology was less rigid in practice than Nazi theory suggested, less determinative of outcomes than Nazi propaganda claimed, less central to national capability than German indoctrination had emphasized. The kindness that German prisoners encountered from American civilians was perhaps most ideologically destabilizing experience because it violated totalitarian logic about how enemies should be treated. Families sent Christmas packages to nearby POW camps containing candy and cigarettes and small gifts, sent these packages to soldiers whose comrades were killing American soldiers overseas, sent gifts that had no propaganda purpose and no strategic value but were simply expressions of humanitarian impulse or religious conviction, and prisoners struggled to understand motivation for this kindness because totalitarian thinking assumes actions serve state purposes and personal kindness toward enemies seems incomprehensible when war is understood as existential conflict between ideologies. Church groups invited prisoners to services, offered them participation in religious community, treated them as souls needing spiritual care rather than as enemies deserving exclusion, demonstrated that religious identity could transcend national identity in ways that Nazi attempts to subordinate religion to state had tried to prevent, and prisoners who attended these services encountered Americans whose primary loyalty was to religious principles rather than to national ideology. Encountered people who believed Christian teaching about loving enemies applied even during wartime, encountered theological framework that valued individuals as humans rather than categorizing them primarily as national enemies. Farmers who employed prisoner work details sometimes shared meals with them, sometimes invited them into homes, sometimes treated them as temporary workers rather than as defeated enemies, demonstrated casual hospitality that made no political sense from totalitarian perspective because why would you share resources with people whose nation was trying to kill your sons? Why would you treat enemies as guests? Why would you extend personal kindness to representatives of regime that was murdering millions? And the only explanation that made sense was that these Americans distinguished between German soldiers as individuals and Nazi Germany as regime, made distinction between soldiers following orders and government making policies, treated prisoners as human beings first and as enemy soldiers second, and this distinction, this separation of individual from system, was foreign to totalitarian thinking that emphasized collective identity over individual humanity, and that treated individuals primarily as representatives of their race or nation or class rather than as persons with individual worth independent of collective categorization. Work details that took German prisoners into American agricultural and industrial operations provided sustained exposure to American abundance that undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than any argument could have. Prisoners working cotton harvests or in canneries or in food processing plants witnessed Americans wasting food, saw produce being discarded because it didn't meet quality standards, saw abundance so vast that perfection was affordable, saw agricultural productivity that explained how America could feed its military and feed Britain and maintain civilian consumption while Germany was rationing everything, and this observed abundance couldn't be explained as propaganda because prisoners were seeing it directly, were participating in production, were witnessing waste that would have been criminal in Germany where every resource was precious and where waste was prosecuted, and the casual American attitude toward abundance, the lack of anxiety about resources, the assumption that more would be available, the willingness to discard rather than salvage, revealed economic capacity that propaganda had denied existed, revealed that American industrial production exceeded what German intelligence had estimated, revealed that America could sustain war efforts that would exhaust Germany because American economic foundation was so much larger that direct comparison was meaningless. Industrial facilities where prisoners worked demonstrated efficiency and organization that contradicted propaganda about American laziness and lack of discipline, demonstrated that American industrial workers could be as productive as German workers despite lacking totalitarian oversight, demonstrated that free labor could achieve outputs that exceeded what coerced labor achieved, suggested that motivation derived from personal benefit might be more effective than motivation derived from ideological commitment or fear, suggested that maybe American approach to labor organization, emphasizing incentives and individual initiative, produced better results than German approach emphasizing discipline and collective duty, suggested that efficiency didn't require totalitarian control and that maybe totalitarian control was actually less efficient than free organization because totalitarian systems wasted resources enforcing compliance and suppressing initiative while free systems allowed workers to optimize their own efforts. The re-education programs that American authorities gradually implemented in POW camps were deliberately subtle, were designed not to impose American ideology but to expose prisoners to information that Nazi propaganda had suppressed, were built on assumption that exposure to truth would undermine lies more effectively than counterpropaganda would, were premised on belief that educated people given access to facts would reach reasonable conclusions without needing indoctrination. Camps established libraries containing German-language books and newspapers that presented non-Nazi perspectives on history and politics, allowed prisoners to read accounts of events that contradicted official Nazi versions, allowed access to information about atrocities that Nazi government had committed and concealed, allowed prisoners to learn about concentration camps and genocide and aggressive war planning that contradicted propaganda about Germany defending itself against encirclement. Classes were offered in democratic governance and economics and history, were taught by German-speaking instructors who presented information rather than demanding acceptance, who encouraged questions rather than requiring ideological conformity, who treated prisoners as adults capable of reasoning rather than as subjects requiring indoctrination, and this pedagogical approach, emphasizing inquiry over instruction, emphasizing evidence over authority, emphasizing reasoning over memorization, was itself lesson in democratic values because it demonstrated that ideas robust enough to withstand questioning didn't require authoritarian enforcement. Newspapers available to prisoners included accounts of German military defeats that Nazi propaganda had concealed or minimized, included evidence of war's progression that made clear Germany was losing, included information about Allied advances and German retreats that contradicted official German communiques that prisoners could remember from before capture, and exposure to accurate information about war's actual status undermined morale among hardline Nazis while providing clarity to prisoners who doubted official accounts but hadn't had access to alternative sources, and this information exposure worked because truth has advantage over lies when both are available for comparison. Lies require consistent reinforcement and isolation from contradictory information while truth remains consistent across sources and can withstand scrutiny. The collapse of Nazi belief among German POWs in America was gradual process rather than sudden conversion, was erosion rather than revelation, was accumulation of observations that contradicted propaganda until maintaining belief required rejecting evidence, required explaining away every discrepancy, required increasingly elaborate justifications for why observed reality didn't match predicted reality, and eventually cognitive burden of maintaining false beliefs exceeded psychological benefit. Of ideological certainty. Prisoners who'd arrived convinced of American degeneracy had to explain why degenerate society was defeating Germany militarily and outproducing Germany industrially, had to explain why racial chaos apparently coexisted with functional government, had to explain why casual dissent didn't produce the collapse that totalitarian theory predicted, had to explain why Americans showed kindness to enemies when propaganda said they'd show only cruelty, had to explain observed abundance that propaganda had said didn't exist, and each explanation required additional assumptions that were themselves questionable, required expanding the conspiracy theory to explain why appearances contradicted reality, required believing that massive coordinated deception was fooling them even though they were seeing American life directly rather than through filtered propaganda. Conversations between prisoners evolved from defending Nazi ideology to questioning aspects of it to eventually discussing how extensively they'd been deceived, evolved from arguments where true believers tried to maintain ideological purity to discussions where former believers described how they'd changed their minds, evolved from political debates to personal testimonies about intellectual transformation, and this evolution happened through peer influence as much as through official re-education. Because prisoners trusted each other more than they trusted American instructors, because hearing fellow German soldiers describe ideological doubts was more credible than hearing Americans criticize Nazi Germany, because social pressure within prisoner community shifted from enforcing ideological conformity to tolerating and eventually encouraging independent thinking, and this shift reflected that totalitarian belief systems are fragile when separated from enforcement mechanisms. When constant reinforcement stops, when alternative information becomes available, when social pressure shifts from supporting ideology to questioning it. Repatriation of German POWs began in 1946 after war ended and continued through early 1947 as hundreds of thousands of prisoners returned to Germany that many barely recognized. Cities were ruined, infrastructure was destroyed, food was scarce, administration was occupied, economy was collapsed, society was traumatized, and returning prisoners experienced cultural shock from encountering devastation that contrasted with American abundance they'd been living among, experienced guilt from having been relatively comfortable while Germany suffered, experienced alienation from civilians who'd endured bombing and starvation and who sometimes resented prisoners who'd been safe and fed in America, experienced displacement from finding that homes and families they'd left no longer existed in forms they remembered, and these returning prisoners carried with them observations and experiences that would influence Reconstruction because they'd seen functioning democracy, they'd witnessed industrial efficiency that exceeded German practices, they'd experienced legal systems that protected individuals even when individuals were enemies, they'd observed prosperity that wasn't built on conquest or racial ideology but on productive capacity and organized labor, and many of them applied these observations in rebuilding West Germany. Post-war surveys indicated roughly 74% of repatriated prisoners expressed pro-democratic sentiments compared to much lower percentages among Germans who hadn't been imprisoned in America, indicated that POW experience had been effective re-education even though re-education hadn't been coercive, indicated that exposure to American life had convinced most prisoners that democracy was preferable to totalitarianism, that free societies were more prosperous than controlled societies, that legal protections were valuable even when they protected enemies, that racial ideology was both wrong and harmful, that political dissent was compatible with functional government, and these changed attitudes influenced West German Reconstruction because thousands of former POWs entered politics and business and education with understanding that German traditions could be combined with democratic principles, that national strength didn't require totalitarian control, that prosperity could be built through free markets and rule of law rather than through conquest and subjugation. Approximately 5,000 former German POWs eventually emigrated to America permanently, chose to return to country that had imprisoned them because they'd concluded America offered opportunities and freedoms that Germany lacked, chose exile from devastated homeland because they'd experienced American society and preferred it to alternatives, and this choice, this voluntary return to former captor, testified more convincingly than any propaganda could about America's appeal, demonstrated that exposure to American life had been persuasive in ways that arguments wouldn't have been, demonstrated that America's strength came not from military power alone but from social system that even enemies found attractive when they experienced it directly. The American victory over Nazi ideology among German POWs wasn't achieved through speeches or through coercion or through forced conversion but through allowing prisoners to observe American life directly, through letting abundance speak for itself, through demonstrating that democracy functioned, through showing that freedom coexisted with order, through treating prisoners according to law rather than according to passion, through maintaining standards that recognized prisoners' humanity even while defeating their nation militarily, and this victory was quiet rather than dramatic, was achieved through accumulation of daily observations rather than through sudden revelations, was product of prisoners reasoning independently rather than being indoctrinated, was result of truth being more convincing than lies when both were available for comparison, and perhaps this approach, this confidence that exposure to American life would be more persuasive than propaganda, this willingness to let enemies observe society directly, This belief that democratic societies could withstand scrutiny while totalitarian societies required controlling information was itself expression of democratic confidence that totalitarian systems couldn't match because totalitarian systems knew their ideology would collapse under examination while democratic systems believed their principles would be vindicated by experience. German prisoners arrived in America expecting brutality and found bureaucracy, expecting starvation and found abundance, expecting racial chaos and found complex society that functioned despite tensions, expecting weakness and found strength, expecting degeneracy and found capability, expecting lies and found truths that were more complex than either propaganda had predicted, and these discoveries occurred not through indoctrination but through observation, not through being told what to think, but through witnessing reality directly, not through conversion but through reasoning independently, and this process of discovery through experience was itself lesson about how free societies differ from totalitarian ones. Free societies allow observation and questioning and independent reasoning, while totalitarian societies require controlling information and enforcing belief and preventing independent thought, and the fact that America allowed German prisoners to see American life directly demonstrated confidence that observation would produce conclusions favorable to democracy, while Nazi Germany's requirement to control all information that soldiers received demonstrated totalitarian fear that truth would undermine ideology. America defeated these men not through arguments about democracy's superiority but by allowing them to experience democracy's consequences, the abundance that free markets produced, the creativity that free speech enabled, the stability that rule of law provided, the prosperity that resulted from treating individuals as valuable rather than as expendable resources for state purposes. And these concrete observations convinced more prisoners than abstract arguments ever could because humans trust experience more than ideology, trust what they see more than what they're told, trust their own reasoning more than authorities' pronouncements, and when experience contradicts ideology consistently across multiple domains over extended time, maintaining ideology requires either rejecting experience or developing increasingly elaborate explanations for why experience misleads, and eventually cognitive burden of maintaining false beliefs becomes unsustainable and beliefs change not through conversion but through recognition that ideology never matched reality and that truth was always available for those willing to observe it. The story of German POWs in America wasn't triumphal narrative where superior Americans enlightened inferior Germans. Wasn't story of forced conversion where defeated enemies were compelled to accept victors' ideology. Wasn't propaganda exercise where captives were indoctrinated systematically. It was quieter story about what happens when people raised in totalitarian system encounter free society directly. When propaganda's predictions are tested against observed reality. When lies are exposed. Not through counter-lies but through access to truth. When ideology confronts evidence and eventually evidence wins because humans are capable of reasoning and learning and changing minds when circumstances change what seems reasonable to believe. America didn't defeat these men with arguments. America defeated lies by allowing the truth to be seen, by letting prisoners observe rather than forcing them to believe, by trusting that experience would teach what indoctrination couldn't, by demonstrating through daily life rather than through speeches that democracy produced better outcomes than totalitarianism, that freedom was compatible with order, that prosperity came from productivity rather than from conquest, that treating enemies humanely was strength rather than weakness, that laws protecting individuals created better societies than systems treating individuals as expendable, and this demonstration through lived experience rather than through imposed ideology was victory that lasted because it was grounded in prisoners' own observations rather than in coerced professions of belief, was durable because it was reasoned rather than forced, was genuine because it emerged from independent thought rather than from submission to authority, and the 425,000 German soldiers who experienced American captivity carried those observations back to Germany, where many of them helped build democracy in nation that had been totalitarian, helped create prosperity in nation that had been ruined, helped establish society that learned from defeat that totalitarianism failed while democracy succeeded not through moral superiority alone but through practical advantages that became visible when both systems could be compared directly, and perhaps that is lesson worth remembering, that some of war's most important victories happen not on battlefields but in daily life, not through force but through example, not through defeating enemies physically but through changing their minds by allowing truth to be visible, by trusting that humans given access to information and freedom to reason will generally reach reasonable conclusions, by believing that democracy's strength comes not from perfecting society but from creating system capable of improvement, capable of learning, capable of functioning despite imperfections, and that this capability, this resilience through adaptation rather than through rigid perfection, is what makes free societies ultimately stronger than totalitarian ones, even when totalitarian organization seems more efficient and totalitarian unity seems more powerful. Because efficiency built on lies eventually fails when reality intrudes, while adaptability built on truth can adjust to whatever reality demands, and German prisoners learned this not through being told but through experiencing it, not through indoctrination but through observation, and they carried this learning home and helped build Germany that remembered what totalitarianism cost and what democracy offered, and that outcome, that transformation of enemies into democrats through experience rather than through force, stands as testament to power of allowing truth to be seen, as evidence that sometimes the most effective victories are the quietest ones, the ones achieved not through conquest but through demonstration, not through forcing belief but through enabling observation, not through propaganda but through simply allowing reality to speak for itself.